In this week's lecture, we're going to examine staffing decisions and some of the strategies IO psychologists use to improve the outcomes of these decisions. This lecture has been divided into 4 parts. In this first part, we're simply going to define staffing decisions. What are they? What do they involve? Staffing decisions are exactly what they sound like. Decisions made about staff. These decisions include those we make about who to recruit, hire, train, promote, and fire. All of these staffing decisions then determine what kind of organization we have. Its culture, its productivity, its strengths, its weaknesses. The criteria for good staffing decisions has changed in the last few decades because work today is very different than it was years ago. For this reason, staffing decisions need to consider the organization's business strategy, its culture, the external environment, the internal environment, and a host of other factors. So staffing decisions are not made within a bubble. There are numerous things that we must consider when making these decisions. Because research and science is at the heart of IO psychologists, they know quite a bit about what works and what doesn't work. They have identified some of the best practices when it comes to staffing decisions. These best practices are called high-performance work practices. For example, using formal job analyses to understand the work. Hiring from within for key management and leadership positions. Basing promotions on merit, not necessarily on tenure alone. And using evidence-based, psychometrically sound tests for selection and performance measurement. There is evidence that these practices can impact the bottom line, and they can positively impact managers, employees, job applicants, the family members of employees, minority groups, unions, and society as a whole. Plus, we know that poor staffing decisions can be disastrous for an organization. It can negatively impact employees' perceptions of the organization, their work, their managers. It can impact commitment, job satisfaction, performance. It can lead to grievances, lawsuits, counterproductive work behaviors. It can waste time and money, and it can distract people from getting the work done. This visual illustrates the staffing decisions involved in the selection process alone. We start with recruitment, then we screen applicants, then we do the bulk of our testing, interviews, assessment centers, knowledge tests. We analyze the data and draw conclusions about the data before we use contingent selection devices to make final decisions. Once we hire applicants, we then have to place them in the appropriate job and teach them about the work and the organization. At any one of these stages, the decision is to continue with the process or reject the applicant. IO psychologists participate by conducting job analyses and developing and validating selection tests. When we think about staffing decisions, many of us think about the applicant or the employee, maybe the manager, maybe the organization, the internal stakeholders. But there are other stakeholders that staffing decisions can impact. Suppliers, society as a whole, local, state, and federal government, creditors, shareholders, customers. When the company does well, all of these entities also do well. When staffing decisions are less than ideal, these stakeholders are not getting the most out of their relationship with the organization. Employees are suffering, managers are suffering. That means customers are probably suffering, which means shareholders, creditors, suppliers are also suffering, and so on down the line. In order to protect stakeholders, the government instituted what are called the Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection Procedures. If you are interested in studying IO psychology in graduate school, you will probably be asked to read these guidelines. Their purpose is to help employers, labor organizations, employment agencies, certification boards follow federal employment laws, specifically those that are related to selection and hiring. On the slide, you can see some of the principles that are covered in these guidelines, things like the standards for validity studies, disparate treatment, affirmative action. In many ways, IO psychologists help organizations ensure that their staffing decisions comply with federal regulations.